The chair they gave me was too tall for. The desk not by much, just enough that my elbows floated 2 in above the surface. If I tried to rest them, I spent the first 40 minutes of the grand chamber session holding my arms, my lap like I was waiting for a bus. Nobody noticed, nobody was looking at me. That was the point. My name is Yara Osai, Commander Earth. Naval Forces, currently serving as Earth's first military attaché to the Galactic Accord. The title sounded important when Earth Command handed it to me 14 months ago, standing in the Grand Chamber on my first day, surrounded by 47 species in ceremonial robes that moved like living things. I understood that the title was not important. The title was a placeholder, a courtesy extended to a species that the Accord had admitted. The way you let a neighbor's kid sit at the adult table during a holiday dinner. You give them a chair, you make sure the chair is slightly wrong, you go back to your conversation. The Grand Chamber was enormous, not in the way that human architecture goes. Enormous, all glass and steel reaching upward to make you feel small. This was enormous, sideways, wide, flat ceiling, built for species that communicated in gestures and needed sight lines across the full room. The Accord had helpfully provided translation units, small devices clipped near each representative's ear that converted the chamber's multi-language chaos into something processable. Mine converted everything into English. It also, I noticed early on, introduced a slight flattening of tone. Every alien voice came through the translator sounding like a patient doctor explaining a diagnosis you were not going to like. Ambassador Kralith of the Veth Dominion was presenting when I arrived. I was 4 minutes late because nobody had told me which of the 43 available entrance corridors led to the human seating section. I found my seat by a process of elimination and quiet apology. Kralith was 9 ft of gray cartilage, arranged into something that was technically a standing posture. He had no neck that I could identify. His head simply began where his shoulders decided to stop. His robes were a deep copper color, layered in a way that suggested rank without showing anything as crude as decoration. He moved at the podium like a man who had never in his life considered the possibility of being disagreed with. He was presenting the Accord's annual military overview, sector by sector, species by species, resource allocation for joint defense initiatives, response time analysis for the Outer Rim Patrol routes. I had read the briefing document on the transport over. It was thorough. It was also, in one specific section, incorrect. The section was titled Civilization Military Classification Index. Under the human entry, in small clean text that clearly expected no objection, emerging civilizations, non-combatant classification, subnote territorial conflict behavior, assessed as ritualistic, non-doctrine, low strategic threat index. I read it 3 times. Then I read the definition of ritualistic that the Accord's Xenosociology division had appended. It described human warfare as emotionally motivated boundary performance lacking the systematic lot of true military engagement. I looked at my floating elbows. I put them in my lap. Kralith finished his section by section breakdown and opened the floor for procedural questions. A representative from the Thurisi hegemony asked about fuel depot positioning on the north Rim, a Vreth delegate raised a point. About patrol overlap near the Vareth. Corridor standard material, the kind of conversation that had clearly been happening in this room for decades, before Earth sent a representative, and would continue happening the same way, regardless of what that representative said. I raised my hand. There was a pause, not long but textured, the kind of pause that communicates without words that a hand going up from that particular seat was not part of the normal schedule. Kralith looked at me, his translator unit presumably told him I was the human. He already knew I was the human. I was the only one in the room whose chair was slightly too tall for the desk. Commander Osai, he said. My name came through the translator with a faint softness, like he was choosing his patience the way you pick a tool from a kid. You have a question? I have a clarification request, I said, about the classification index. The human entry. Of course, he gestured toward the display behind him where the index was still visible. Is there a translation error? We can have our language division review the entry. No, I said, the translation is fine. I wanted to ask about the assessment methodology when the xenosociology division reviewed human conflict records. What was the time range they examined? Kralith exchanged a look with someone off to his left, another Vreth. I assumed, though at this distance they were difficult to differentiate. A comprehensive review, he said. Your species documented conflict history. Several thousand years of recorded engagements. And their conclusion was that it's ritualistic. That it displays strong ritualistic characteristics. Yes, territorial, emotionally motivated, lacking the systematic escalation doctrine that the Accord uses to define genuine military engagement. He said it gently. That was the part that landed somewhere under my sternum, not the content, the gentleness. Your species has made remarkable progress, Commander. The achievement of your post-conflict civilization period is genuinely impressive. Post-conflict, I repeated. Your last major interspecies war ended over a century ago by Accord standards. That is an extended peace period. It suggests a maturation of social priority away from conflict resolution through force. He nodded, which on a Vreth apparently means the equivalent of a reassuring smile. It is a sign of development. The chamber murmured, agreement in 17 frequencies. Some of it was probably even sincere. I sat with that for a moment. The murmuring, the gentle nods, the copper robes and the coral reef formal wear, and the 47 species who had looked at every war humanity had ever fought and concluded that we had grown out of it, that we were better now, softer, ready for the big table. I thought about a particular morning, particular city, a particular sound that is not like any other sound on Earth, and that I have never been able to fully unknow. I let the thought sit exactly where it was. I did not follow it. Thank you for the clarification, Ambassador, I said. Of course. He turned back to the chamber. If there are no further questions on Section 4, we will move to resource allocation for the coming cycle. There were no further questions on Section 4. I wrote a report that night, sat in my assigned quarters, which were comfortable and slightly too cool, because no one had asked what temperature humans preferred, and I Wrote 4 pages, filed it with Earth. Command, the subject line was they have no idea what they're looking at. Earth Command's response came back in 6 hours. It said keep smiling. I kept smiling. 3 weeks into my posting, I learned that the Accord's military representatives had a private shared channel, not secret technically, just not mentioned. To me, I found it by accident while calibrating my comm unit and recognized it by the fact that it went quiet the moment my signal appeared. I did not bring it up. I recalibrated my unit and went back to reading the Accord's public military archives, all of them, every battle record, every tactical debrief, every strategic review the Accord had ever declassified. I read them the way I used to read terrain maps before operations, not for what they said, for what they assumed. Every Accord military doctrine assumed an opponent who would, at a specific and calculable point, stop. Every model built on the premise that there was a threshold, a loss percentage, a resource depletion point, a moment where continuing became more costly than surrendering. Their warfare was, in a very precise way, a negotiation, a brutal one, a costly one, but a negotiation. Every engagement in their records followed the same deep grammar, push, until the other side's algorithm tips. Watch for the signal, accept the signal. Stop. I read all of it. I took notes in the margins of a physical notebook I had brought from Earth because I did not fully trust the Accord's document systems. The notebook had a small Earth flag on the cover, a gift from my sister. Before I shipped out, she had no idea what I was heading into, neither did I. Honestly, but she had more excuse for it. I filled 30 pages of that notebook in 3 weeks. At the top of the first page I had written one question: what happens when one side doesn't have a threshold? I drew a line under it. Then I went to sleep. The next morning I had another session. In the grand chamber, another chair at the wrong height, another session where the most important conversation in the room was the one nobody was having. I smiled my way through 3 hours of resource allocation debate, fixed my collar button twice, said nothing that anyone would remember. Earth Command would have been proud. The symposium was called a cultural military exchange. The announcement described it as an opportunity for member civilization to share their conflict histories in the spirit of mutual understanding and collective security. It was scheduled for a full cycle, 4 days in Accord time, with each species receiving a presentation slot. I was invited as a courtesy. That word appeared twice in the official communication. I noticed both times. My slot was last slot of the last day, the time given to things the organizers consider least essential. I knew what it meant. I had spent enough time in rooms where I was the afterthought to recognize the scheduling logic. I spent the 3 days before my slot watching every other presentation with my notebook open in my lap. The Threshy hegemony went first. Their lead representative, a tall creature named Veltherin, wore armor that had been polished so thoroughly it functioned as a mirror. He presented with enormous dignity. The Threshy war tradition, he explained, was built around what they called the season of resolution. Conflicts were formally declared between 2 parties. A field was designated by mutual agreement. The engagement date was set months in advanced to allow both sides to position their forces. Casualties were tallied in real time. When either side's losses reached a predetermined cap, both parties withdrew. The outcome was determined by which side held more of the designated field at that moment. The chamber applauded for a long time. Several representatives made notes. Veltherin bowed with an elegance that suggested he had been practicing bowing since childhood. The Vreth collective presented second. Their representative, a small gray figure named a sick Vrou, stood very still at the podium and spoke in a voice that was almost too calm to follow. The Vreth approach to conflict, he explained, was mathematical. Before any engagement, both parties ran identical resource projection models. The models calculated projected losses against projected gains at each stage of escalation. When the model projected that continuing would cost more than winning would return, that side automatically signaled withdrawal. Both sides accepted the signal immediately. No engagement in Vreth history had ever exceeded the model's projected duration by more than 4%. The chamber applauded louder. Kralith himself nodded with what appeared to be genuine admiration. I wrote 3 words in my notebook: no threshold concept. 2 more species presented that day, both variations on the same deep grammar: conflict as calculation, and GT snorts, and GT war as a process with agreed stopping conditions built into the structure before anyone fired a single shot. The Accords collected military history was at its core the history of species that had figured out how to fight without losing control of the process. I went back to my quarters and ate a meal I had replicated from Earth. Ingredients that never quite tasted like the real thing. I thought about what I was going to say the next day, not the words. I already had the words. I thought about how much of the truth to give a room that had spent 3 days applauding the idea that war had rules everybody followed. The answer I kept arriving at was enough. Give them enough, not all of it enough. My presentation slot began at the end of the 4th day. The chamber had a different quality by then. The energy of the earlier sessions had settled. Representatives who had been attentive for their own slots were now in that late conference state of polite presence, watching without quite seeing, listening without quite hearing. I walked to the podium with no display prepared, no holographic model, no visual aids. I set my notebook on the podium, opened to the first page, and looked at the room. I am going to talk about what happens when we lose, I said. The translator units distributed my voice across the chamber, the slight flattening of tone that I had noticed on my first day was still there. I had learned to speak around it, cleaner sentences, harder consonant, leave less room for the machine to soften what did not deserve to be softened. Nobody reached for their notes. That was new. Every presentation this week described conflict as a system, I said, a set of rules that both sides follow because following them produces a better outcome than not following them. The threshy cap their losses. The Vreth run the math. Everyone stops when stopping makes sense. I looked at Kralith. He was watching me with the careful attention of someone who is not sure yet whether they need to be concerned. I want to talk about what humans do when stopping doesn't make sense. I paused, let the translator catch up. When a human force is losing, the losses don't trigger withdrawal. They trigger a specific kind of problem solving. The situation gets worse, so the people inside it start asking questions that they didn't ask before, because before they didn't need to. How do we destroy that thing? What's it made of? Where does it have to be to function? What happens if we remove that part? What happens if we hit it here and then here before it can respond? I kept my voice level, not flat level. There is a difference. Human military history is not the history of armies following a process. It is the history of people in desperate situations, inventing new processes in real time, under pressure, with limited resources, against opponents who were better equipped and sometimes better trained. The chamber was quiet, not politely quiet, actually quiet. We have a word for it, I said. Adaptation. It sounds simple. It is not simple. Adaptation under fire means that the version of us you face in the first hour of a conflict is not the version you face in the third hour. We change. We change in response to what you do. The more effectively you engage us, the faster we change. Ambassador Kralith shifted in his seat. It was a small movement. I catalogued it and moved on. I want to be clear about something, I said. I'm not saying this to suggest that humanity is a threat to the Accord. We are not. We applied for membership in this body voluntarily. We attend these sessions. We follow the protocols. We want to contribute to collective security. I closed my notebook. I am saying this because the classification your Xenosociology division assigned to us describes our warfare as ritualistic, emotionally motivated, non-doctrine. And I want you to understand that this classification is incorrect, not as an insult, as a technical error. A representative from the Oracy Federation, a small amber-colored figure, 3 rows back, raised a secondary limb. Commander Os, you describe your species as adaptive under pressure, but your last major conflict ended over a century ago. How do you account for the current absence of this behavior? Surely a century of peace indicates that the capacity has diminished. I looked at them for a moment. We didn't stop because we ran out of the capacity, I said. We stopped because we ran out of opponents who could survive long enough to make it. Interesting. The chamber went very still, different from the attentive quiet of before. This had a texture to it, the particular quality of a room where 47 species have just recalibrated something. Kralith broke it. His voice came through my translator with that patient doctor tone, but something in the underlying frequency was different. Slightly less relaxed. Commander, with respect, this reads as cultural pride rather than military assessment. Your species has not engaged in a significant conflict in over 100 years. Theoretical capacity you are describing has no recent empirical support. I nodded. That's fair, I said. I hope you never get the empirical support. I gathered my notebook and stepped back from the podium. The applause, when it came, was polite. The kind that means the room is still processing and needs something to do with its hands. That evening, the Accord's official symposium report was filed. It described my presentation as emotionally motivated historical revisionism, likely a face-saving mechanism for a species with limited military relevance. The language was diplomatic, carefully chosen. I read it twice on the shuttle back to my quarters. Then I read the note Earth Command had. Attached to the forwarded report, 3 words, no punctuation. They'll remember this. I put the notebook away and looked out. The small window at the dark between stars. I was already thinking about the Verath corridor patrol data I had requested 3 weeks ago and still not received. There was a reason I wanted those files. There is always a reason. The Karath sovereignty sent no warning. Before they moved, that was the first thing that told me they were different from every other species in the Accords. Conflict history, warnings are a habit. Every species in the Accord warned before they escalated, even in conflicts where warning made no tactical sense. Warning was built into the deep grammar of the way they thought about war. It was the opening move, the signal that the negotiation had begun. The Karath sent nothing. One day the outer rim was normal, the next 3 Accord member state stations along the southern edge of the Verath corridor were gone. Not damaged, gone. I was in my quarters when the alert came through. I was eating breakfast, real eggs replicated from a calibration I had spent 2 months perfecting. I put the fork down when I read the first line of the alert, and I did not pick it up again. By the time I reached the monitoring post where I had been assigned, the situation had developed in every direction at once. The Accord's Joint Military Command had already mobilized Admiral Threshverin, a massive Thressi with a service record that the Accord considered exemplary, was coordinating from the command carrier at the center of the Accord fleet. His voice on the open channel was calm and precise. He was describing formations and response vectors and intercept trajectories with the confidence of a man who had run these calculations before. My posting was logistics support. I had a desk, I had a terminal, I had a clipboard physical because someone on the Accord administrative staff thought humans might find it comforting. I looked at the clipboard for approximately 3 seconds, then I set it on the floor and started pulling up everything the Accord's intelligence division had filed on the Karath sovereignty. There was less than I expected, more than they deserved credit for knowing, given how little attention they had paid. I read it all in 40 minutes, took notes not in the notebook, on the back of a fuel allocation form, because it was what I had. What I found was this: the Karath were fast and they were precise, and they had spent 40 years studying the Accord's military doctrine in the same way I had spent 3 months studying it. They knew how Accord species fought. They knew the deep grammar, and they had built their entire operational strategy around a single insight that was so obvious I was surprised nobody in the Accord's intelligence division had spotted it. If you know exactly how an opponent will behave in each phase of an engagement, you don't need to be stronger, you just need to be in the right place before they get there. The Accord fleet engaged the Karath at the Verath corridor at what the tactical log later recorded as 9:14 hours local fleet time. Threshverin's formations were correct by every measure of Accord doctrine. Symmetric, proportional. The engagement opened with the standard declaration of hostile encounter, transmitted on the frequency that all Accord-adjacent species were assumed to monitor. The Karath did not respond to the declaration. They were already moving. They did not hit the battle line. They hit the admirals, not Threshverin directly. His command carrier was too well protected, but they, 3 wing commanders coordinating the flanking formations, each of them on a dedicated command vessel positioned exactly where Accord doctrine placed command vessels, which meant exactly where the Kareth had planned to look. All 3 were struck in the first 4 minutes. The Accord fleet did not collapse. It was too disciplined for that. It fell back on pre-filed contingency orders, which was the correct response, which was also the problem. The contingency orders were exactly what Accord doctrine prescribed for a loss of wing command. The Kareth had the Accord's doctrine files. I did not know that for certain in that moment, but I was very close to certain, and close to certain is enough to work with. The fleet went tactically coherent and strategically predictable in the same moment, 40 ships in 11 minutes, and then the battle settled into a shape that was slowly, methodically grinding toward a conclusion that nobody on the Accord side seemed to fully see yet. I pulled up the comm panel and looked at it. My orders were to manage the logistics. Q. Keep the supply lines warm. Flag any fuel allocation irregularities. I looked at the fuel allocation form I had been writing on. Then I looked at the tactical display, showing the Accord fleet's current position and the Kareth fleet's current position and the specific gap between them that was developing in a way that matched almost precisely a pattern I had seen in my notebook 3 weeks ago. Not from any Accord record, from a human military archive that the Accord's Xenosociology Division had assessed as emotionally motivated historical revisionism. I picked up the comm unit, called Earth Command on the frequency I was technically permitted to use for administrative purposes. My voice was calm. It usually is when things get bad enough. They need us, I said. Yes or no? 6 seconds. I counted them. 6 seconds of silence from a command post that was watching the same data feeds I was watching and had been watching them longer. 6 seconds is a long time when you have been waiting 2 years for a room to take you seriously. Earth Command's response came back clean and short. Do not wait for permission. I put the comm unit down, pulled up every tactical channel I had been politely, systematically excluded from for 2 years. The Joint Fleet channels, the real-time positioning feeds, the Kareth intercept data that the Accord's intelligence division had been compiling, but not yet interpreting in any way that was going to matter in the next 30 minutes. There were 4 Earth naval officers at the logistics post with me. Lieutenant Owen Greer, the youngest, was watching me from across the room. He had been filing fuel forms for the past 6 hours. He had the expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment without letting himself admit it. Greer, I said. Commander, close the fuel forms. He closed them before I finished the sentence. The others followed. No drama, no questions. That is the thing about people who have been waiting. They do not need to be convinced. They just need to be told. I pulled up the tactical display and started talking. My voice was very calm. It usually is. When things get bad enough, that is the part they never understood about us. We do not panic when it gets worse. We get quieter and quieter and quieter until the quiet is the most dangerous thing in the room. The Accord fleet had a blind spot, not a failure of equipment or intelligence. Failure of assumption. They were watching the Kareth the way you watch an Opponent who fights the way you fight. They were looking for formations and escalation signals and the specific behavioral tells that precede each phase of a doctrine-based engagement. They were watching for the moves they recognized. The Kareth were not making moves the Accord recognized. That was the problem. But the Kareth were also not making moves I failed to recognize. There is a concept in human military history that does not have a precise equivalent in Accord tactical literature. It is the idea that the most important thing in any engagement is not the other side's strength, it is the other side's map. What they think the battlefield looks like, where they believe you are, where they believe they need to be. If you understand their map completely, you do not need to be stronger, you just need to exist in the places their map says you won't. I had spent 3 weeks reading Kareth historical engagement records, not the summaries the Accord's intelligence division had compiled, the raw records, translated badly from Kareth data formats into something my terminal could process, full of gaps and errors and passages that made no sense until I read them 3 times. I had filled 30 pages of my notebook with patterns, and sitting in that logistics post with Greer and the other 3 officers, watching me across their closed fuel forms, I was very sure of one thing. The Kareth map was accurate and complete for every opponent they had ever faced. They had never faced us. Here is what we are going to do, I said. I talked for 4 minutes, no visual aids, no display graphics, just the words in the room and 4 people who listened. The way people listen when they understand that the next hour is going to matter for a very long time. The Earth vessels attached to our logistics post were small, 3 ships. Support class. The Accord's classification system put them somewhere between a courier vessel and a mobile maintenance platform. They were not designed for combat engagement. They were not armed in any way the Accord's weapons assessment teams would have recognized as militarily significant. They were, however, fast, and they carried equipment that the Accord's teams had cataloged as communication and navigation hardware, which it was in the same sense that a blade is kitchen equipment. We did not enter the battle line. Battle lines are visible. Battle lines are on the Kareth's map. We went around at the far edge of the engagement zone, outside the sensor range that the Kareth's doctrine said was the boundary of an active combat theater, because that was where Accord doctrine placed the boundary, and the Kareth had studied Accord doctrine. There were 7 Kareth communication relays, small, low signature, the kind of infrastructure you do not need to protect heavily when your opponent has never demonstrated the inclination to look for it. Greer took the comm panel. Lieutenant Addie Warren, who had been filing fuel forms for 6 hours and had previously spent 8 years as a signal specialist before transferring to logistics, took the navigation systems. I watched the tactical display and counted. The first relay went dark at minute 3, the second and third at minute 4. The Kareth fleet registered the loss, and the doctrine response was immediate, clean, and exactly what I expected. Tighten the formation route. Communications through the primary command chain. Continue engagement with the Accord fleet while the relay situation was assessed. Tightening the formation moved 3 Kareth vessels into a position they would not otherwise have occupied. The fourth relay went dark at minute 5, the fifth and sixth at minute 6. At minute 7, the Kareth fleet was locally intelligent and globally confused. Every individual ship knew its own orders. None of them could confirm whether those orders still matched what the rest of the fleet was doing. They started repeating actions, executing maneuvers against positions the Accord fleet had vacated 40 seconds earlier, committing to vectors based on an engagement picture that was now too full minutes out of date, which in a fluid engagement is a very long time. I watched the Kareth flagship. It was moving to a position that its doctrine prescribed for a situation exactly like this one: loss of relay infrastructure, act fleet still engaged, need to reestablish command visibility. The flagship moved to the high ground coordinate, the elevated tactical position from which a Kareth commander could theoretically see and restore order to the full engagement. It was a reasonable move. It was the correct move by every rule in the Kareth playbook. It was also a position I had been waiting for since minute 1 and had specifically created conditions to produce. I told Warren. She did not ask me to confirm. She ran the calculation and executed. The Kareth flagship went dark at minute 9. Not destroyed dark. There is a specific vulnerability in the Kareth command architecture that I had identified from their publicly available construction records, the ones the Accord's Intelligence Division had filed and then not read closely because they were construction records and not obviously tactical documents. The flagship's primary command systems ran through a single redundant pathway when under communication stress. Hitting that pathway correctly at the right angle with the right frequency of interference did not destroy the ship. It removed the flag from the fleet. A Kareth fleet without a flag follows contingency orders. The contingency orders, which I had found in a technical appendix to a 14-year-old Kareth Defense Review that was publicly accessible in the Accord's General Archive, moved the Second Fleet flagship to a coordination position. A specific coordination position. Owen Greer looked at me when the positioning data updated. His face said, "Everything?" "Yes," I said. The second Kareth flagship moved to where its doctrine told it to go. That position was not favorable for the Kareth. The Accord fleet was still engaged, still following Thresh Varen's contingency orders, still fighting the shape of battle that the Kareth had designed for them. But the Kareth fleet was now operating without coordination, without relay infrastructure, with two flagships, either dark or displaced, and with a full picture of the engagement that was 3 minutes out of date and getting older. The Kareth fleet signaled withdrawal at minute 14. Clean signal, proper format broadcast on the frequency that all Accord-adjacent species were assumed to monitor. We had started moving at minute 1. The signal came at minute 14, 11 minutes of actual operational time. I sat back in my chair. The room was quiet. Greer was staring at his console. Warren had her eyes closed, not because she was tired, because she was holding the moment in place before it moved on. I thought about Kralith, about the word ritualistic in small clean text, about the gentle nod that meant he was giving me patience because he thought I needed it. I thought about the sandpit on the main Accord tactical channel. There was static for a long time. The battle had ended faster than the command Infrastructure had processed, Thresh. Varen's fleet was reading withdrawal. Signals from an opponent they had not yet fully understood was losing. Then Thresh Varen's voice came through. He did not say anything for a long time. I let him not say it. Greer turned from his console and looked at me. He started to speak, then he didn't. Then he said very quietly, "Commander, they're going to want to know how we knew." "Yes," I said. "What do we tell them?" I looked at the tactical display. The dark signatures were the Karath relays. Used to be the displaced flagships, the clean geometry of a fleet that had been taken apart not by strength, but by the simple, ancient act of understanding exactly what it was going to do before it did it. "We tell them we read their files," I said. "That's all." He thought about that, then he nodded. Slowly, the way people nod when they understand something they are going to be thinking about for a long time. I picked up the comm unit, called Earth. "Command." I said one word. The channel closed. I sat in the too-cool room with its closed fuel forms and its borrowed tactical displays, and I did not feel triumphant. That is the part nobody ever gets right about these moments. You do not feel triumphant. You feel the weight of the thing correctly. You feel it completely, and then you start thinking about the next problem, because there is always a next problem, and the weight does not get lighter by carrying it slower. There was an emergency session of the Galactic Accord scheduled for the following morning. I had a collar button to fix. The chamber was full, not the usual occupancy, representatives in their designated seats with half their attention on something else, full, every seat in the grand chamber occupied. Species I had seen represented by deputies were now represented by their primary ambassadors. The chamber had the quality of a room that had made an effort, that had decided this particular session warranted the real version of everyone inside it. My chair was still the wrong height. I noticed it when I sat down and felt my elbows float above the desk, same as the first day, same as every day before it. I had stopped expecting them to fix it. Somewhere around month 2, it was not malicious, it was simply that no one had ever thought to check. I put my hands in my lap. The session was opened by the Accord's presiding officer, a Vreth named Asik Tau, who was not the same individual who had presented at the symposium, but was built along the same quiet lines. Charges were read formally, unsanctioned. Military engagement, breach of non-combatant classification protocol, unauthorized assumption of tactical command during an active accord operation. Each charge was accurate. I had committed all 3. I had committed them deliberately, with full knowledge of what they were in the sequence that was required to produce the outcome that had saved approximately 40 Accord vessels and an unknown number of crew. Kralith was seated to my left 3 rows forward. He was watching me with an expression that I could not fully read, which was unusual. Kralith's face, for all its alien geometry, had become legible to me over 2 years of sessions. I knew his patient's face. I knew his dismissal face. I knew the particular stillness he wore when he found something beneath engagement. This was none of those faces. This was something I had not seen from him before. I catalogued it and moved on. Asik Tau finished the charge reading and invited me to respond. I stood up. "I don't dispute the charges," I said. I would like to address their context. Nobody objected. That was also new. Ambassador Kralith, I said, would you pull up the classification index? The military one on the main display. I would like the full entry. A pause longer than necessary for a simple request, then the display behind. The podium populated with the index. My entry, emerging civilizations. Non-combatant classification. The subnotes, the xenosociology assessment. All of it large enough for every seat in the room to read without effort. I read it aloud, all of it, every line. I read it the way you read something. That deserves to be read in its complete form so that no one in the room can later say they did not hear it. When I finished, I closed the display file from my terminal. You reviewed our entire recorded conflict history, I said. You looked at every engagement we ever fought, every strategy we ever developed, every opponent we ever faced. I looked at the room, not at one section of it, all of it, and you concluded that it was ritualistic, that we were a post-conflict species, that whatever we had been, we had grown past it. I let that sit for a moment. I want to be careful here, I said. I'm not angry about that conclusion. I understand why you reached it. Humanity's last century looks from the outside like a species that found peace and settled into it. We reduced our active military infrastructure. We redirected resources towards science and expansion. We stopped fighting. To an observer using the frameworks your xenosociology division uses, that looks like maturation. I walked to the podium, set my notebook down, open to the first page, the question I had written 3 months ago. What you did not ask, I said, was why. The chamber was absolutely still. We did not stop fighting because we became peaceful, I said. We did not stop fighting because we developed better social systems or more enlightened values or a deeper commitment to negotiated resolution. Those things happened, they are real, but they are not why the war stopped. I looked at Kralith. His expression had shifted again. The unreadable thing had become something I could almost name. We stopped fighting, I said, because we had exhausted the available opposition. Not in one war, not in one era, over 200,000 years of continuous adaptation against every opponent we encountered in every environment we occupied under every possible condition of disadvantage and resource limitation and technological gap. We adapted, we changed, we became, over a very long time, something that was no longer capable of being beaten by the kind of opponents we were generating. A representative from the Oracy Federation, the same small amber figure who had questioned me at the symposium, raised a limb. Commander, yesterday's engagement, you disrupted the Karath fleet using communication infrastructure that your vessels were not classified to carry. You executed a tactical operation that the Accord Joint Command had no knowledge of. How? I read their files, I said. Silence. The Karath's construction records are publicly accessible in the Accord's General Archive. Their historical engagement doctrine is referenced in 14 different diplomatic correspondence files that the Accord received over the past 40 years and did not assess for tactical content. Their contingency command protocols are derivable from 3 open-source military reviews they filed with the Accord when they were briefly seeking membership 8 years ago. I paused. I read all of it. I read it because reading things is free and not reading them has a cost. That doesn't appear until it's very expensive. Kralith spoke, his voice through my translator was stripped of the patience. Register just the words. Commander, what you're describing is a form of intelligence and tactical analysis that the Accord's own military divisions did not produce from publicly available materials in 3 weeks. 2.5 weeks, I said, I spent. The other half on the Verith corridor. Patrol data. The chamber made a sound that was not applause and was not objection. Something in between, a collective intake of breath translated 17 different ways. Humanity was not admitted to this body. As a military power, Kralith said. Slowly, we admitted you as an emerging civilization, a developing species with a promising future. I know, I said. The classification is wrong, I said. That is what I am asking you to correct. I set the data chip on the podium. Earth. Command had sent it with me on the transport. It was small black, no markings. Inside it was the full declassified tactical doctrine library of the human species, all of it. Everything we had developed, refined, abandoned, rediscovered, and refined. Again across 200 millennia of continuous conflict, the formations and the counter-formations, the logistics models and the anti-logistics strategies, the communication architectures and the 17 documented methods for dismantling them, the complete record of what a species produces when it spends 200,000 years treating war as a problem worth solving. Completely. We would like a new classification, I said. We would also like to be useful to you. These are not the same request. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the environmental system cycling air through the vents above the eastern seating section. One of those requests is optional, I said. Asik Tau presiding spoke carefully. Which one is optional, Commander? I looked at the data chip, then at the room. Being useful, I said. The silence stretched. Then Kralith asked, very quietly in a voice I had never heard from him in 2 years of sessions, not the patience voice, not the dismissal voice. Something that required a new category entirely, and the non-optional one. The classification, I said. We would like to be correctly classified, not because the label matters to us, because an incorrect label leads to incorrect decisions, and incorrect decisions in the context of collective security have consequences that are not limited to the species being mislabeled. I picked up my notebook, left the data chip on the podium. We are not asking for a seat at the table that is slightly smaller than everyone else's, I said. We are asking to be seen accurately, that is all. See us accurately, classify us correctly. Let us contribute to this body's security as what we actually are, and in exchange, we will be the most useful thing you have ever admitted to. Membership. I walked back to my seat. The chair was still the wrong height. My elbow still floated 2 inches above the desk. I put my hands in my lap and looked forward and let the room do what it needed to do. It took 6 days. 6 days of closed sessions and debate and consultation between species and review of the data chip contents, and what I was later told was a genuinely significant argument between the Accord's Xenosociology Division and its Joint Military Command about methodology and prior assessments and who bore responsibility for the error. I spent those 6 days in my quarters, eating replicated food that almost tasted right, reading the Accord's outer rim defense architecture files that I had requested 3 months ago and just received, and writing in my notebook. The new classification came through on the morning of the 7th day. An official Accord document transmitted to my quarters and to Earth Command. Simultaneously, the language had been constructed carefully, no prior equivalent in Accord taxonomy. The preamble noted, new category generated for accuracy of representation, Apex class combatant civilization, active treaty status. I read it 3 times. Then I sent Earth Command one word. Finally, I looked out the small window of my quarters at the dark between stars, all that space, all that nothing that humanity had spent 2 years being politely contained within the outer rim, with its patrol routes, the Varath corridor with its geography that I had now memorized well enough to navigate from memory the 7 relay positions that were currently empty because the Karath had withdrawn them after the engagement, which told me something specific and useful about what the Karath were planning to do next. I was already thinking about the next problem. There is always a next problem. But first I let myself have the moment. Really have it, not performed, not filed away as a data point in an ongoing analysis, the actual moment with its actual weight sitting in a chair that was still the wrong height after 2 years of nobody thinking to fix it. I laughed. I do not know exactly when the laughing became something else, or whether it was ever purely one thing or the other. I know that the dark outside the window was enormous, and that humanity had spent a very long time being the smallest thing in whatever room it occupied, patient and smiling and filing its reports, waiting for the room to understand what it was actually looking at. The room understood now. I wiped my face, picked up my notebook, turned to a fresh page. At the top of it I wrote one sentence. Now we get to work. Then I looked at the outer rim defense files and started reading. There was a gap in the Varath corridor. Patrol coverage, it had been there for 4 years. Nobody had flagged it. It was in the publicly available Accord Defense Review if you read the footnotes, which apparently nobody had. I picked up my pen. Some things never change.